Chapter 7 of Cranford by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 7. Visiting. One morning, as Miss Matty and I sat at our work, it was before 12 o'clock, and Miss Matty had not changed the cap with yellow ribbons that had been Miss Jenkinson's best, and which Miss Matty was now wearing out in private, putting on the one made in imitation of Mrs Jamieson's at all times when she expected to be seen. Martha came up, and asked if Miss Betty Barker might speak to her mistress. Miss Matty assented, and quickly disappeared to change the yellow ribbons, while Miss Barker came upstairs; but as she had forgotten her spectacles, and was rather flurried by the unusual time of the visit, I was not surprised to see her return with one cap on top of the other. She was quite unconscious of it herself, and looked at us with bland satisfaction. Nor do I think Miss Barker perceived it, for, putting aside the little circumstance that she was not so young as she had been, she was very much absorbed in her errand, which she delivered herself of with an oppressive modesty that found vent in endless apologies. Miss Betty Barker was the daughter of the old clerk at Cranford who had officiated in Mr Jenkins's time. She and her sister had had pretty good situations as ladies' maids, and had saved money enough to set up a milliner's shop, which had been patronised by the ladies in the neighbourhood. Lady Arley, for instance, would occasionally give Miss Barkers the pattern of an old cap of hers, which they immediately copied and circulated among the élite of Cranford. I say the élite, for Miss Barkers had caught the trick of the place, and piqued themselves upon their aristocratic connection. They would not sell their caps and ribbons to any one without a pedigree. Many a farmer's wife or daughter turned away huffled from Miss Barkers's select millinery, and went rather to the universal shop, where the profits of brown soap and moist sugar enabled the proprietor to go straight to Paris, he said, until he found his customers too patriotic and John Bullish to wear what the monsieurs wore; London, where, as he often told his customers, Queen Adelaide had appeared, only the week before, in a cap exactly like the one he showed them, trimmed with yellow and blue ribbons, and had been complimented by King William on the becoming nature of her headdress. Miss Barkers, who confined themselves to truth, did not approve of miscellaneous customers, throve notwithstanding. They were self-denying, good people. Many a time have I seen the eldest of them, she had been maid to Mrs Jamieson, carrying out some delicate mess to a poor person. They only aped their betters in having nothing to do with the class immediately below theirs. And when Miss Barker died, their profits and income were found to be such that Miss Betty was justified in shutting up shop and retiring from business. She also, as I think I have said before, set up her cow, a mark of respectability in Cranford almost decided as setting up a gig is among some people. She dressed finer than any lady in Cranford, and we did not wonder at it, for it was understood that she was wearing out all the bonnets and caps and outrageous ribbons which had once formed her stock in trade. It was 5 or 6 years since she had given up shop, so in any other place than Cranford her dress might have been considered passé. And now Miss Betty Barker had called to invite Miss Matty to tea at her house on the following Tuesday. She gave me also an impromptu invitation, as I happened to be a visitor, though I could see she had little fear lest, since my father had gone to live in Drumble, he might have engaged in that horrid cotton trade, and so dragged his family down out of aristocratic society. She prefaced this invitation with so many apologies that she quite excited my curiosity. Her presumption was to be excused. What had she been doing? She seemed so overpowered by it, I could only think that she had been writing to Queen Adelaide to ask for a receipt for washing lace; but the act which she so characterised was only an invitation she had carried to her sister's former mistress, Mrs Jamieson. Her former occupation considered, could Miss Matty excuse the liberty? Ah, thought I, she has found out that double cap, and is going to rectify Miss Matty's headdress. No, it was simply to extend her invitation to Miss Matty and me. Miss Matty bowed acceptance, and I wondered that, in the graceful action, she did not feel the unusual weight and extraordinary height of her headdress. But I do not think she did, for she recovered her balance, and went on talking to Miss Betty in a kind, condescending manner, very different from the fidgety way she would have if she had suspected how singular her appearance was. "Mrs Jamieson is coming, I think you said?" asked Miss Matty. Mrs Jamieson most kindly and condescendingly said she would be happy to come. One little stipulation she made, that she should bring Carlo. I told her that if I had a weakness it was for dogs. "And Miss Pole?" questioned Miss Matty, who was thinking of her pool at Preference, in which Carlo would not be available as a partner. "I am going to ask Miss Pole. Of course I could not think of asking her until I had asked you, madam, the rector's daughter, madam. Believe me, I do not forget the situation my father held under yours." "And Mrs Forrester, of course?" "And Mrs Forrester. I thought, in fact, of going to her before I went to Miss Pole. Although her circumstances are changed, madam, she was born at Tyrrell, and we can never forget her alliance to the Biggs, of Bigelow Hall." Miss Matty cared much more for the little circumstance of her being a very good card player. "Mrs Fitz-Adam, I suppose?" "No, madam, I must draw a line somewhere. Mrs Jamieson would not, I think, like to meet Mrs Fitz-Adam. I have the greatest respect for Mrs Fitz-Adam, but I cannot think her fit society for such ladies as Mrs Jamieson and Miss Matilda Jenkyns." Miss Betty Barker bowed low to Miss Matty, and pursed up her mouth. She looked at me with sidelong dignity, as much as to say, although a retired milliner, she was no democrat, and understood the difference of ranks. "May I beg you to come as near 6:30 to my little dwelling as possible, Miss Matilda? Mrs Jamieson dines at 5, but has kindly promised not to delay her visit beyond that time, 6:30. And with a swimming curtsey, Miss Betty Barker took her leave. My prophetic soul foretold a visit that afternoon from Miss Pole, who usually came to call on Miss Matilda after any event, or indeed in sight of any event, to talk it over with her. "Miss Betty told me it was to be a choice and select few," said Miss Pole, as she and Miss Matty compared notes. "Yes, so she said. Not even Mrs Fitz-Adam." Now, Mrs Fitz-Adam was the widowed sister of the Cranford surgeon, whom I have named before. Their parents were respectable farmers, content with their situation. The name of these good people was Hoggins. Mr Hoggins was the Cranford doctor now; we disliked the name and considered it coarse, but, as Miss Jenkyns said, if he changed it to Piggins it would not be much better. We had hoped to discover a relationship between him and that Marchioness of Exeter, whose name was Molly Hoggins, but the man, careless of his own interests, utterly ignored and denied any such relationship, although, as Miss Jenkyns had said, he had a sister called Mary, and the same Christian names were very apt to run in families. Soon after Miss Mary Hoggins married Mr Fitz-Adam, she disappeared from the neighbourhood for many years. She did not move in a sphere in Cranford society sufficiently high to make any of us care to know what Mr Fitz-Adam was. He died, and was gathered to his fathers, without our ever having thought about him at all. And then Mrs Fitz-Adam reappeared in Cranford, as bold as a lion, Miss Pole said, a well-to-do widow, dressed in rustling black silk, so soon after her husband's death that poor Miss Jenkyns was justified in the remark she made, that Bombazine would have shown a deeper sense of her loss. I remember the convocation of ladies who assembled to decide whether or not Mrs Fitz-Adam should be called upon by the old blue-blooded inhabitants of Cranford. She had taken a large rambling house, which had been usually considered to confer a patent of gentility upon its tenant, because once upon a time, 70 or 80 years before, the spinster daughter of an earl had resided in it. I am not sure if the inhabiting this house was not also believed to convey some unusual power of intellect, for the earl's daughter, Lady Jane, had a sister, Lady Anne, who had married a general officer in the time of the American War, and this general officer had written 1 or 2 comedies, which were still acted on the London boards, and which, when we saw them advertised, made us all draw up, and feel that Drury Lane was paying a very pretty compliment to Cranford. Still, it was not at all a settled thing that Mrs Fitz-Adam was to be visited, when dear Miss Jenkyns died, and, with her, something of the clear knowledge of the strict code of gentility went out also. As Miss Pole observed, as most of the ladies of good family in Cranford were elderly spinsters, or widows without children, if we did not relax a little, and become less exclusive, by and by we should have no society at all. Mrs Forrester continued on the same side. She had always understood that Fitz meant something aristocratic. There was Fitzroy; she thought that some of the king's children had been called Fitzroy; and there was Fitzclarence now; they were the children of dear good King William the Fourth. Fitz-Adam, it was a pretty name, and she thought it very probably meant child of Adam. No one, who had not some good blood in their veins, would dare to be called Fitz. There was a deal in a name; she had a cousin who spelt his with 2 little f's, Folks, and he always looked down upon capital letters, and said they belonged to lately invented families. She had been afraid he would die a bachelor, he was so very choice. When he met with a Mrs Farringdon, at a watering place, he took her immediately, And a very pretty genteel woman she was.